The Howard estate stood on the highest rise of the Virginia fields, holding itself as if it were not built by human hands but grown out of the soil for a purpose no one wanted to name. And every traveler who passed along the dirt road felt the same uneasy pull toward its windows, the tall, narrow panes that seemed to watch without ever blinking. People said the glass never clouded, never collected dust or fingerprints, even during summer storms when red mud spattered every other house for miles, and neighbors swore that the wind changed direction when it reached the Howard fence line, slowing into an unnatural stillness as if something in the air refused to cross. From a distance, the house looked peaceful, a neat white structure with a clean porch and chimneys that always burned a gentle smoke. Yet anyone who stared too long felt a pressure behind the eyes, a quiet warning that the house was studying them just as much as they were studying it. In the 1890s, the land around it still carried the memory of war. But the Howard estate felt older than battle scars, older than the county, older than the country itself. And the locals whispered that the family had come from somewhere deep in the mountains, carrying old habits and older secrets that never fit into polite conversation. The Howards kept to themselves, not out of shyness, but out of a strange, practiced calm that made people careful around them. And while the townsfolk pretended to accept their quiet life, no one failed to notice that the couple had no children, or at least none they ever allowed anyone to see. Some said they had lost infants long ago, and the grief made them private. Others said they preferred silence and order too much to allow a child to disrupt their routine. But a smaller group believed something worse, something that nobody wanted on record, something about late-night deliveries in soft shapes carried inside after dusk, shapes too small and too still to be anything good. Rumors spread the way mold spreads under floorboards, slowly at first, then all at once, until the story took on a life of its own, and people began to wonder why no schoolteacher had ever received a Howard child, why no doctor had been called for fevers or broken bones, why no young voice had ever been heard from the porch or the yard. The silence of the estate grew heavier with each season, settling over the fields like a blanket pressed too firmly over a sleeping body, and those who had reason to walk past the house at night reported seeing candlelight move from room to room in a steady pattern, never hurried, never warm, almost like someone inside was following a schedule more important than rest. That rhythmic glow created a feeling that the house itself was alive and following its own rules, something patient and careful, something that hid its intentions behind the polished front door and the friendly nods the Howards offered whenever they came into town. People noticed small, unsettling details like how Mrs. Howard smiled too slowly as if reminding herself how to mimic human warmth, or how Mr. Howard stood too still when listening, his eyes fixed on a person's face with an attention that felt less like conversation and more like examination. Some neighbors said the Howards were simply strange, quiet people with odd habits, but others felt sure that something in the house was feeding on secrecy, that some form of hunger lived there disguised as normal life, that the couple's gentle voices and polite manners were only the surface of a deeper mind, shaped by rules no one else could understand. Children dared each other to run up the path and touch the porch rail, yet every child who tried came back pale, describing the same strange sensation of coldness that did not match the summer air, a coldness that seemed to rise through the wood like breath from something sleeping underneath the house. As autumn came, even the animals avoided the property, walking wide circles around it as though warned by instincts older than language. By the end of the year, the estate had become a quiet landmark of fear, a place everyone knew but no one confronted, and rumors grew into stories about voices heard inside when the windows were shut and shadows moving across the drapes when the Howards were supposedly in town. People forced themselves to ignore these signs, telling each other it was better not to interfere with things that did not concern them. But deep down they understood that evil does not always arrive with noise. Sometimes it settles quietly into a household and teaches itself to smile, waiting for the day when someone finally notices the truth behind that smile. And as the winter approached, marking the season when nights grew longer and secrets grew harder to hide, the land around the Howard estate held its breath in a way that felt almost human, sensing that whatever lived inside that house was ready to let its story unfold, piece by piece, in ways no one in the county was prepared to face. The wagons always came after sunset, when the roads softened into darkness and the lamps on the porches flickered with weak, tired light, and the townsfolk learned to close their curtains the moment they heard wheels rolling slow over the dirt. They pretended not to listen, yet every ear pressed a little closer when the horses stopped near the Howard gate. followed by the faint rustle of blankets and the soft, uneven breaths of small bodies being lifted down. No one ever saw faces. Only small shapes bundled in heavy cloth, carried in the careful grip of drivers who never spoke, never looked around, never stayed long enough for questions. The children never cried, never called out, never resisted. An unnatural quiet that made even the boldest neighbors back away from their windows, telling themselves that silence meant safety, when in truth it meant fear. The Howards appeared each time as if summoned, stepping from the house with lanterns held low, their shadows stretching out across the yard like long fingers reaching for whatever the wagons delivered. Mrs. Howard always moved first, her voice soft and calm in a way that should have been comforting but felt practiced, as though she had memorized the rhythm of kindness without understanding the feeling beneath it. Mr. Howard followed with slow steps, guiding the children with a hand on their back, not firm but deliberate, encouraging them toward the house with the same quiet patience someone might use with delicate objects that must not be dropped or damaged. From far away the scene looked gentle, but there was something wrong in the way the children moved, too stiff, too obedient, responding more to unseen rules than to human warmth. They walked as if they had been taught to step in exact patterns, as if their bodies remembered instructions their minds had not fully understood. Some children kept their heads lowered, others stared straight ahead with wide, blank eyes, but none looked at the townsfolk who watched from behind half-closed curtains. It was as if they had already accepted the house as their only destination, their final stop, their place of unspoken submission. The wagons always left quickly, turning back toward the main road with no exchange of money, no conversation, no sign that the drivers had ever been there. By the time the dust settled behind the wheels, the children were gone inside and the Howard door closed with a soft thud that carried farther through the night than it should have, echoing in the hearts of people who insisted they had seen nothing. In the following days, the Howards walked through town with polite smiles, acting as though nothing unusual had happened, chatting about weather and crop yield with a friendliness so polished it felt hollow. Mrs. Howard touched her neighbor's arm while saying how peaceful the farm had been, how restful the nights were, each word shaped with perfect care, and yet her eyes never reflected the warmth her voice pretended to carry. Mr. Howard offered help to anyone who needed it, lifting crates, repairing fences, always showing the strength and reliability of a good man, and still there was a strange calm in him that felt copied rather than natural, as if his understanding of kindness came from studying it like a specimen rather than feeling it in his bones. People wanted to believe them. They wanted to believe that new children meant charity, that the Howards were rescuing orphans or helping families in secret. But the truth pressed against their minds each night when they lay awake hearing the faintest hint of distant footsteps on the road, footsteps that belonged to children who would not be seen again. Days turned to weeks, and yet no child ever wandered the Howard fields, no small voice ever echoed from the porch, no extra plates appeared at church suppers. It was as though the children dissolved into the walls the moment they entered the house. No doctor in town was ever summoned to check fevers, no teacher received a letter about enrollment, no tailor was asked to sew clothing in smaller sizes. The children simply vanished into the daily life of the estate, leaving only the memory of their small silhouettes and the quiet dread of what might wait behind those locked doors. Some neighbors tried to convince themselves that the children were kept indoors for safety or discipline, but others felt the truth pushing through their excuses, that the Howards were not caretakers but collectors, choosing their children not with love but with need. There was something ritualistic in the timing of the deliveries, always arriving on nights when the moon dipped low behind the hills and the air felt heavy enough to press against the chest. There was something strange in how the children carried themselves, as though they had been prepared long before they reached the estate. And there was something chilling in the way every arrival brought a faint flicker of movement behind the Howard windows, a pale shape drifting from room to room as if checking that each new child entered correctly, obeyed correctly, disappeared correctly. The town had no proof, only fear, and fear was a poor weapon against a house that watched every road, every field, every breath of wind. Soon no one dared to speak of the wagons at all. They pretended the children never came, just as they pretended the Howards were ordinary, but denial did nothing to change the truth. Something inside the Howard home was waiting, growing, shaping the children into something the outside world was never meant to witness. And as the next sunset approached, The land itself seemed to tighten with dread, sensing that the quiet deliveries were only the beginning of what the estate planned to reveal. The Howard estate had always been large, but no one in town could remember when it had grown into the silent labyrinth it became by the winter of 1891. People swore the house looked different each year. An extra window here, a longer hallway there, a roofline that expanded just enough to make the eye question its memory. Yet no carpenter in the county claimed to have worked on it, and no one had ever seen wagons carrying lumber or brick to the property during daylight. The house changed the way a snake sheds its skin, quietly, privately, leaving behind only the faint sense that something underneath had grown larger. The first hint of hidden rooms came from an aging surveyor who had once mapped the estate decades earlier and still kept a faded copy of his original blueprint. He showed it to the sheriff one evening, pointing out how the drawing didn't match the house people now walked past. The parlor seemed bigger than before. A hallway had shifted by several feet. A storage room, once listed plainly on the plan, no longer had a visible door. The sheriff brushed it off, saying old paper stretched with moisture, but his voice carried the uncertainty of a man telling a lie he hoped would become true. The surveyor, however, noticed more than missing rooms. He noticed added space that had no obvious purpose, long rectangular gaps sealed within the walls, as if the house were swallowing parts of itself. When he quietly asked Mrs. Howard about renovations, she smiled a slow, gentle smile and said the house only needed love, not repairs. Her words lingered with him for weeks, especially the way she spoke love, stretching it just long enough to feel wrong, as if she meant something closer to obedience than affection. Rumors spread again, not in loud gossip, but in quiet, nervous conversations held behind closed doors. People began to look more closely at the estate during their daily routines. They noticed how sections of the house never lit up at night, even though the outline of the building suggested many more rooms than anyone had ever seen illuminated. They noticed how the windows on the eastern side were always dark, coated on the inside with something that dimmed the glow of lanterns, though no smoke ever rose from that part of the roof. And eventually they noticed the humming. It began faintly, more vibration than sound, a low rhythmic pulse that drifted across the fields like a heartbeat buried beneath the earth. At first, only the closest neighbors heard it, lying awake with their blankets pulled tight as the strange hum rose and fell in perfect intervals. It was not music. It was not machinery. It was too steady to be wind and too measured to be anything natural. Some described it as a soft throb, others as a murmur of breath, but all agreed it felt intentional, as though someone or something inside the estate was keeping time. After several nights, the humming grew louder, spreading through the cold air until even children began to notice. A few claimed the sound helped them fall asleep, like a lullaby wrapped in dread, while others begged their parents to make it stop, insisting that the noise made their bones feel heavy. Adults offered explanations they didn't believe. Pipes settling, animals moving beneath the floorboards, distant farm machinery. But the sound came from the same direction every night, the sealed side of the Howard estate, the part of the house that never showed light, the part no one had entered in years. One brave neighbor, a farmer who lived closest to the property line, decided to investigate. He walked to the fence one moonless night, hoping darkness would hide him, but even before he reached the gate he felt the humming vibrating through the ground. His lantern flickered once, then steadied, as though the air around him shifted in recognition. He placed his hand on one of the fence posts and felt a pulse echo through the wood in measured beats, slow and deliberate. It reminded him of a living thing, something with a heart too large and too old to belong to a single person. He stepped back immediately, nearly tripping as he hurried home. The next morning he told his wife they were never to walk near the estate again. Inside the house, the secrets grew as the rooms continued to multiply in ways no one could explain. Some visitors, rare as they were, noticed oddities they tried to ignore. A hallway that seemed slightly longer on the way back than it had on the way in. A door that appeared new despite the rest of the house aging around it. A soft draft that came from walls rather than windows. The Howards brushed off every question with gentle, polite laughter. Their voices perfectly pleasant, yet stripped of sincerity. Mr. Howard often said the house shifted as needed, a phrase that unsettled people more the longer they thought about it. What did it need and who decided that need? Over time, the sealed rooms became a subject of whispered theories. Some believed the Howards used them for storing supplies or preserving food through harsh winters, though no deliveries supported the idea. Others spoke, only in private, of hidden children trapped behind the walls, locked away to keep their existence a secret. But a darker belief threaded through the town, spoken only by those who had heard the humming most clearly, that the rooms were not meant to hold things, but to shape them, that inside those walls something was being changed, molded, prepared with ritual precision. And though no one dared to admit it out loud, many suspected the house was not simply being remodeled, it was being fed. The humming continued each night, counting out its rhythm, growing more confident as winter deepened. People tried to dismiss it as imagination, but deep down they understood the truth they could no longer ignore. Something in the Howard home was awakening, and whatever waited in those hidden rooms was not meant for daylight. Soon the town would learn that humming was not a warning. It was a beginning. The townsfolk always said the Howards carried the gentlest smiles, the kind meant to reassure frightened children. Yet anyone who stood close enough could feel the hollowness behind those expressions, a subtle emptiness like a mask that had been practiced so many times. It no longer resembled a human feeling. To strangers they appeared as perfect caretakers, speaking in calm tones and bending down to meet a child's eye level. But once the doors closed and the world outside faded, their behavior shifted into something cold and controlled, a pattern of affection stripped of warmth and built on rules only they understood. Inside the house, Mrs. Howard moved with a soft firmness, her hands always placed in the same positions, on a shoulder, on the back of a small neck, guiding the children with gentle pressure that looked loving until one noticed how precise it was, how she adjusted each child as if aligning pieces on a board. She murmured phrases that sounded comforting from a distance. Yet when listened to closely, they carried no emotional core at all, only measured tones designed to keep a child compliant. Mr. Howard, too, spoke with a steady calm that felt more like instruction than conversation, asking questions in slow, careful rhythms as though he were tracking how long it took each child to respond, how their eyes moved, how their breathing changed with every request. Their kindness was not kindness. It was a study. The children felt it long before they could explain it, sensing that the Howards were observing them the way scientists examine test subjects, watching for patterns, reactions, mistakes. Every gesture the couple offered was rehearsed, repeated, sharpened. When the children were allowed into the main rooms of the house, the atmosphere shifted into a quiet ritual the Howards seemed to take pride in. Mrs. Howard would brush a child's hair with slow strokes, counting under her breath, never missing a beat. And if a child flinched or looked away, she would pause, not in concern but in correction, tilting the child's face back into place with a stillness that warned against disobedience. Mr. Howard would teach the children tasks like folding linens or sorting objects, but he never praised them. He only noted their speed, their precision, their errors. He watched their hands more closely than their faces, fascinated by how quickly they learned to mirror his movements. When a child hesitated or made a mistake, he did not scold them with anger. Instead, he gave a small, disappointed smile, the kind that froze the air around the room. And in his soft voice, he would tell them they had broken a rule, though no child ever understood how the rules were made or why they kept changing. The house itself supported these strange rituals. Curtains were kept half-drawn during the day, so the rooms always held a dim, muted glow that made time hard to track. Clocks hung on walls, but their hands never moved, as though the Howards believed regular time did not apply inside their home. Instead, there were other signals, subtle cues that the children learned to follow, like the exact moment the lanterns were lit each evening, or the soft double tap Mr. Howard made on the dining table when he expected silence. The children adapted quickly, not out of obedience but out of fear of the consequences, for the Howards never raised their voices, yet their punishments carried a deeper weight than anger ever could. A child who broke a rule might be told to stand with their back against a wall for hours, frozen in place while the couple took notes in small leather books, marking down posture, breathing, and the way fear changed the child's expression. Another might be made to sit at the foot of the stairs while the Howards discussed them just loud enough to be heard, evaluating the child's behavior as though they were not in the room at all. These moments were presented as lessons, meant to improve the children, but in truth they were experiments designed to watch how far a child would bend before breaking. The coldest moments came late at night, when the house went quiet except for the soft hum behind the walls and the children lay in their narrow beds staring at the ceiling, knowing they were being watched even in sleep. The Howards opened doors without a sound, stepping inside just far enough for their faces to be lit by the hallway lantern, their eyes scanning the room in a slow sweep before withdrawing again. There was something searching in their gaze, something calculating, as if they were waiting for one of the children to fail an unspoken test. This nightly inspection became a ritual the children dreaded more than anything else, because the Howards never explained what they were looking for, only that they had to look. Sometimes Mrs. Howard lingered longer than necessary, her head tilted slightly to the side as she whispered something to herself, perhaps a judgment or comparison, and the children would lie as still as death, pretending to sleep, hoping her thoughts did not settle on them. Yet the most unsettling part of their strange parenting was the way they spoke to the children about becoming better. They said it often, in soft tones, always with that false smile that curved their lips but never reached their eyes. They spoke as though the children were incomplete beings who needed shaping, smoothing, fixing. They said things like, "You are almost ready," or "You must learn to be quiet inside." Phrases that meant nothing but felt like warnings. And slowly the children understood that the Howards were not raising them, they were altering them. Their touch, their words, their rituals were not signs of care but tools, refining each child according to some private blueprint. There was no affection in the house, only measured progress. By the start of spring, the children moved with the same quiet steps as the Howards, their voices soft, their expressions dulled, their instincts bent into shapes they barely recognized. The couple watched this transformation with quiet, pleased nods, as though each change confirmed something they had always believed. Outside, the town still viewed the Howards as gentle guardians. But inside the estate, the truth grew clearer with every passing day. Whatever kindness the couple displayed was only a mask hiding the cold machinery of their intentions, and the children trapped in their home were not being raised to live normal lives. They were being prepared for something else, something the house itself seemed to understand. And as night settled once more and the humming behind the walls deepened, the children sensed that the next stage of the Howards' plan was drawing closer, waiting for the right moment to reveal itself. The journals were hidden in plain sight, stacked neatly on a shelf in the Howard study, their covers labeled with ordinary titles like winter stock records and sewing notes, harmless names meant to distract anyone who might glance at them. But inside, beneath lines written in tidy handwriting and careful margins, the pages held the Howards' true purpose. They were not diaries or household logs. They were records of corrections, detailed accounts of how each child was slowly unmade and rebuilt, stripped of their own history piece by piece. The entries did not describe children as people. They described them as tasks. Each page carried a child's symbol instead of a name, followed by long notes about behavior, reactions, fears, and weaknesses. The writing was calm, almost gentle, never angry or emotional, which made the words all the more disturbing. It was the tone one might use to track the growth of a garden or the aging of wine, not the dismantling of a child's identity. The punishments inside were not wild or violent. They were precise, methodical, shaped to break the mind rather than the body. Some entries described long sessions where a child was made to repeat a phrase until the words lost meaning and became nothing but breath, the goal being to empty the child of anything that sounded like self. Others detailed exercises meant to confuse memory, where the Howards retold events the child had lived through but altered small details, teaching the child to doubt their own recollection until their past became soft clay the couple could reshape. The most unsettling methods were those that involved silence. The Howards believed silence was a tool, and they used it to erase the world inside a child's head. They would isolate one child at a time in a narrow space, never described exactly, only referred to in the journals as the still room, a place where sound was swallowed so completely that even breathing felt unnatural. The child would stay there not for minutes but for entire evenings, left alone with no anchor except their own thoughts, until those thoughts twisted into fear or dissolved into numbness. The journals praised silence as a purifier, a way to wipe away stubborn memories that clung too tightly. Another method, described with chilling pride, involved the manipulation of routine. The Howards adjusted meal times, sleep cycles, and daily tasks, shifting them by small increments each day until the children no longer understood morning from night or hunger from fullness. Without the markers of normal life, the children's sense of time softened, and their thoughts became easier to mold. One entry noted how a child had begun to ask permission before speaking, not because they were taught to, but because uncertainty had become their only compass. The journals recorded this as progress. There were also rituals involving the children's symbols, the wooden tokens carved with simple shapes that replaced their names. Each child was required to trace their symbol over and over on cloth squares, a task described as reinforcement. The journals noted how repetition of the symbol helped detach the child from their previous identity, making them more receptive to instruction. The process was slow and unnatural, designed to create confusion between who they had been and who the Howards wanted them to become. The symbols became the only part of themselves the children were allowed to keep, yet even that was controlled, redefined, measured. The cruelest methods were not physical. They were attempts to overwrite the mind. In some entries, the Howards described a practice they called reassignment, where they told one child to act as another child for a full day, mimicking their tasks, mannerisms, and behaviors. Mistakes were corrected with cold consistency, and success was rewarded only with a slight nod or a note in the journals. The children learned to bend themselves into any shape the Howards requested, losing pieces of themselves each time. The journals tracked which children adapted quickly and which required more guidance, though the word guidance was used with unsettling vagueness. The Howards believed that identity was a fragile thing, something that could be peeled away layer by layer, and they treated each child accordingly. The children rarely cried. They had learned that tears meant extended correction, longer hours in the still room, or repeating tasks until their hands trembled with exhaustion. The journals treated emotional breakdowns not as tragedies but as opportunities, moments when the child was receptive to adjustment. The cold neutrality of the writing made the suffering behind it feel even deeper, like pain recorded without being acknowledged. The house supported these methods with its strange architecture. Some rooms seemed built for disorientation, hallways that curved slightly, floors that slanted just enough to unsettle balance, windows placed too high to see the sky. The journals noted which children reacted with fear and which reacted with silence, tracking every change with the same calm attention a doctor might use to record symptoms. In one long entry written in the steadier script of Mr. Howard, he described how a child had begun to release unnecessary memories, a phrase that repeated several times in the months that followed. By spring, the journals recorded that 4 children had reached what the Howards called readiness, though what readiness meant was never explained. There were no notes on what happened after readiness, only blank pages that felt less like an ending and more like a doorway. Outside the walls of the house, the world continued as if nothing unusual happened within. The townsfolk saw the Howards smile, heard their polite voices, watched them buy sugar and flour like any other couple. They had no idea that behind those gentle expressions lived a quiet hunger, an obsession shaped into ritual. The journals captured that hunger in every line. They revealed a truth the world was never meant to know. The Howard children were not being raised. They were being rewritten, and the next stage of that rewriting was about to begin, waiting in the silent rooms the house kept hidden from the sunlight. The rituals began long before dawn, at an hour when the valley was nothing but a quiet bowl of darkness, and the Howard estate felt separated from the rest of the world. In that darkness, the children gathered in the main hall, bare feet on cold floorboards, thin nightclothes trembling at the hem, waiting for the day to begin. They were never called by names. Names had weight, the Howards said. Names held memories, roots, and histories, and roots were dangerous things. Roots taught children to believe they were someone, when the Howards believed they were meant to become something else entirely. Each child carried a small wooden token around their neck, tied with a strip of faded cloth. The tokens were carved with simple symbols: a crescent, a circle, a line split down the center, a triangle that dipped in the middle as if bowing. No 2 symbols were alike. The Howards claimed the shapes held meaning, though the children never learned what that meaning was. The tokens felt heavy despite their size, not in weight but in expectation. They were reminders of what the child had been chosen to become, or what the Howards intended to carve them into. The morning ritual began with silence. Absolute silence. The children stood shoulder to shoulder in neat rows, tokens resting against their chests like second-beating hearts, waiting for Mr. Howard to appear. He always entered slowly, his footsteps soft, yet echoing, as though the house itself amplified him. Mrs. Howard followed, her hands folded, her smile gentle in a way that made the younger children tremble. Her gentleness was scarier than her husband's severity. She looked at the children with the pride of a gardener tending a crop that grew exactly as she planned. Once the couple reached the center of the room, Mr. Howard would lift a long wooden rod and tap the floor 3 times. The sound was a cue, not a command. A command required words, and the rituals were older than words. The 3 taps marked the beginning of the children's transformation for the day. The ritual schedule shifted constantly, modified, rewritten, reinterpreted, but its foundation never changed. Break identity, reinforce obedience, elevate the symbol. Each child stepped forward when their symbol was called, not called aloud, never aloud, but indicated by a small gesture from Mrs. Howard. She would lift her hand in a certain direction, her fingers angled like a shape themselves, and the child bearing the matching symbol would walk forward. They learned the gestures through trial and error until instinct replaced thought. Instinct was easier to mold. Once chosen, the child would place both hands over their token and speak a single phrase. "I release what I was." They said it softly, almost whispering, and yet the room carried the words like they were part of the house's structure. The other children repeated the phrase in their heads. They did not dare say it aloud unless instructed. Spoken incorrectly, the phrase earned a night in the still room. The children feared the still room more than any punishment, more than hunger or exhaustion, more than the cold eyes of Mr. Howard. The still room was the closest thing to losing oneself entirely. No one wanted to return. After the phrase, the chosen child would be assigned the day's tasks. The tasks were simple: sorting beans by color, stitching long rows of fabric, writing lines on chalkboards, but each action had a hidden rule woven into it. The point was not the task itself, but how the child responded to it. Did they move too quickly? Too slowly? Did they hesitate? Did their hands shake? The Howards watched everything with the detached curiosity of scientists observing a rare experiment. Mistakes were not corrected with shouting. Mistakes were corrected with rituals. If a child hesitated, Mrs. Howard would place her hands on their shoulders and remind them, gently but firmly, that symbols never hesitate. Symbols are steady. Symbols move when guided. Children who remembered they were children, who clung to emotion or memory, were the ones who faltered. And faltering meant adjustment. The ritual schedule also included what the Howards called unburdening. It happened after the noon meal, which was plain and sparse, a meal that left the children full enough to continue the day, but hungry enough to feel malleable. During unburdening, each child sat cross-legged in a dim room lined with shelves that held more tokens, hundreds of them, carved by hands long gone. The room smelled of cedar and dust. The children were told to breathe slowly, to imagine themselves emptying old thoughts. The Howard said the mind had corners that needed clearing before new lessons could settle. Unburdening sessions lasted different lengths depending on the child. Some were kept for minutes, others for hours. No one cried. Crying belonged to people with identities. The Howards believed silence was a higher form of obedience, and the children learned to offer it willingly. As afternoon stretched into evening, the children transitioned to a ritual called alignment, a ceremony where the tokens were polished with cloth and recited into like prayers. The children would sit in a circle, tokens clasped in both hands, whispering a phrase assigned to their symbol. The phrases were fragmented and strange, like pieces of doctrine torn from a larger scripture the Howards never revealed. Some phrases sounded comforting, others ominous, but all of them guided the children away from who they had once been. The rituals worked slowly, shaping the children from the inside out. They began to move alike, speak alike, think alike. Individual quirks faded. Preferences disappeared. The older children remembered pieces of their old lives, a mother's voice, a warm blanket, a favorite color, but the memories felt distant, like someone else's dreams. The younger children forgot almost everything. By nightfall, the children stood in the hall once more, tokens hanging still against their chests. Mr. Howard would tap the floor with the rod again, 3 soft cracks like a heartbeat out of rhythm. The children bowed their heads. They were dismissed without a word. As they filed back to their narrow rooms, they did not look at each other. Names were forbidden, and so were attachments. The Howards said names created ties, and ties created resistance, and resistance was the greatest flaw a vessel could possess. The children slept with the tokens beside them, their last thought before drifting into silence always the same. If I release enough, maybe they will finally see me as ready. But readiness in the Howard house was not salvation. Readiness was simply the next stage of erasure. She was known only by her symbol, a small wooden token carved with a downward arc, like a smile turned on its head. The Howards called it the Crescent Child, though they never spoke the title aloud where the others could hear. She had arrived months earlier, carried into the estate after sunset like the rest, wrapped in a blanket stitched with tiny green leaves. Mrs. Howard removed that blanket the same night and burned it in the yard without a word. Yet despite the ritual cleansing, something in the girl refused to be erased. She remembered things she was not supposed to remember. The memory that anchored her began as a color, warm, honey-yellow light on a kitchen wall. It flickered in her mind like a match caught in the wind, threatening to snuff out at any moment. When she closed her eyes, she could almost hear someone humming. A woman, maybe. A gentle tune rising and falling. The memory had no name attached to it, but names were dangerous here, and so she guarded the image instead. It was the only part of her old life that had survived the stripping, the unburdening, the strict ritual schedule that pressed the children into blankness. And though it grew fainter each week, she fought to keep it alive. The Howards noticed the weakness in her posture before they noticed the flicker of defiance in her eyes. She followed the rituals, but not with the smooth emptiness the others displayed. Her hands trembled slightly when she polished her token. Her gaze drifted during unburdening sessions. When the children whispered their phrases in the alignment circle, she finished a heartbeat late. These were small mistakes, barely noticeable, but the Howards were experts in studying subtle fractures. They believed true obedience created silence in the soul, and this child's soul made noise. Mr. Howard first addressed the issue during an early morning ritual. He stepped closer to her than usual, his shadow stretching long across the floorboards. She felt him observing her, peeling away her stillness layer by layer as if he were reading the memories she tried to hide. He did not speak. He didn't need to. His silence was a threat shaped like a question. Why do you cling to something that no longer belongs to you? She lowered her gaze, but something in her chest tightened, resisting the pull of his authority. When she hesitated, completing her assigned task, sorting dried seeds by size, Mrs. Howard called her forward for a revision. The word sounded harmless, like a teacher guiding a student to correct an error, but revisions were anything but gentle. They were designed to carve obedience into the mind, not through pain alone, but through confusion, exhaustion, and the deliberate unraveling of self-trust. The girl was taken to a room she had never seen before. It was narrow and dim, with tall shelves lined with jars of different sizes. Each jar held something small inside, a smooth stone, a strip of cloth, a feather, or a fragment of wood with symbols etched on it. She felt the walls closing around her as Mrs. Howard gestured for her to sit on a low stool in the center. The door shut behind them with a soft click that sounded final. Mrs. Howard began the revision with a series of simple questions. What is your symbol? What is your phrase? Where do your thoughts belong? The girl answered correctly, though her voice wavered. Mrs. Howard stepped closer, her eyes warm but hollow, and asked another question, not one found in the ritual schedule. Do you ever dream of anything before this house? She murmured as if curious. The girl's heart raced. She shook her head too quickly, too obviously. Mrs. Howard's smile did not change, but a faint disappointment flickered across her face. That disappointment was more frightening than anger. The revision intensified. The girl was instructed to stare at the jars on the shelves for long stretches of time, reciting her phrase until her voice cracked. She was told to switch between jars when Mrs. Howard tapped the floor, sometimes after minutes, sometimes after seconds. The taps were irregular, purposely unpredictable. By nightfall, her senses felt unsteady, as if her mind were slipping sideways. The revision was meant to pull her away from memories and anchor her fully to the symbol she wore. But the more the Howards tried to strip her, the more tightly she clung to the honey-yellow memory flickering in the corner of her mind. The suffering did not echo loudly through the halls. It whispered through the floorboards, carried by her unsteady breathing when she was returned to her room. The other children did not look at her when she reappeared. Looking was forbidden. But silence had a way of transmitting truth, and they sensed something inside her remained unbroken. Over the following days, the cracks in the Howard system began to show. The girl's defiance was subtle, small choices that would have gone unnoticed if not for how carefully the house watched every movement. She folded her bedding imperfectly on purpose. She walked a half step slower during transitions. She paused before reciting her phrase, even if for only a moment. These were tiny rebellions, but in a house built on precision, even a breath out of rhythm was a danger. One night during alignment, she did something even bolder. While the children whispered their ritual phrases, she let her fingers trace the edges of her token, searching for something familiar. And she found it, a tiny ridge in the wood, smooth on one side, rough on the other. It reminded her of the carved animal toys she once owned, though she could not remember what animal it had been. That tiny ridge became her proof that she had existed before the Howards. It was enough to steady her. The Howards saw the change immediately. Her eyes no longer drifted blankly like the others. There was a quiet resolve in them, a glow that hinted at memory. Mr. Howard stiffened during the evening inspection. Mrs. Howard watched her with a narrowed gaze, trying to isolate the source of her resistance. They whispered to each other behind closed doors, planning the next revision, something stronger, something final. But resistance, once sparked, has a way of spreading. The other children began shifting in subtle ways too. A hesitation here, a glance there. Even without names, they recognized something awakening among them. They felt the tension building, bending the rigid shape of the rituals. The Howards believed obedience was a perfect structure, but the girls' small acts of defiance had done something they never anticipated. They had introduced a fracture, and in a house built on secrets, even the smallest fracture could become the beginning of collapse. Winter arrived early that year, not with gentle flurries, but with a sharp, unforgiving storm that wrapped the Howard estate in white silence. Snow piled against the windows in uneven drifts, reaching halfway up the lower panes by dawn. The trees around the property bent under the weight of ice, their branches glinting like broken glass in the weak morning light. In town, people spoke of the storm as if it were a living thing, creeping down from the mountains with purpose, choosing which roads to seal and which fields to bury. But no one dared wonder aloud what it meant for the children behind the Howard walls. Winter was an isolating season. Isolation was exactly what the Howards preferred. The estate looked abandoned from a distance. No footprints broke the smooth blanket of snow around the house. No path led to the door, no trail showed movement from one building to the next. It was as though nothing inside ever stepped outside. The townsfolk found that detail strange. Even animals left tracks. Even ghosts were said to disturb the snow. But the Howard estate remained untouched, the smooth white surface unbroken, as pristine as a canvas no one dared mark. And yet at night, voices drifted across the frozen fields, thin, wavering sounds carried by the wind like cries swallowed by distance. People living closest to the estate heard them most clearly. They said the voices were not sharp enough to be screams, but not soft enough to be prayer. They sounded like instructions being repeated, or warnings trying to reach the world beyond the walls. Inside the house, the children felt winter differently. The cold seeped through the floorboards even when the fires burned high, wrapping around their legs like an unseen rope. The walls tightened, vibrations traveling through them as if the house itself had begun breathing slower, adjusting to the deep freeze. The Howards moved through the halls with their usual calm precision, but even they seemed to tread more quietly, as if winter demanded a certain reverence. Daylight lasted only a short while. By afternoon, the shadows stretched long across the rooms, and the children's silhouettes on the floor looked doubled. One shape that moved with them, and another that lagged behind, distorted and stretched like a reflection on water. Outside, the snow muffled every sound. Inside, it magnified the smallest one. The tap of a token brushing against fabric echoed. A child's uneven breath after a failed ritual sounded louder than a shout. Even the scrape of Mrs. Howard's shoes across the wooden floor carried through the halls like a warning. But the strangest sound began on the third night of the storm. Tapping. Soft at first, almost gentle. A pattern, then a pause. Another pattern, then a longer silence. At first, the children assumed it was ice shifting against the windows, expanding and contracting with the cold. But ice did not follow rhythm. Ice did not repeat. The tapping began near the hidden rooms behind the walls, places the children were not allowed to enter, places they were told belonged to preservation. The sound traveled, moving from one wall to another, never steady, never predictable. It felt alive. The Crescent Child heard it most clearly, her defiant senses sharpened after enduring so many revisions. On the fourth night, she pressed her ear against the wall behind her small bed and felt the faintest vibration travel through the wood. The tapping came in pairs, 2 light knocks, then 3. She did not recognize the meaning, but her heart responded to it, as though someone was speaking a language meant only for those who remembered life before the symbol. The Howards noticed the shift in behavior among the children. Their eyes moved toward the walls more often. Their hands paused during alignment rituals. Their ears tilted slightly. When the house sank into evening silence, Mrs. Howard took this as a sign of contamination, an unapproved distraction pulling the children's minds away from their duties. Mr. Howard saw it differently. To him, the tapping was a test. If a child reacted, it meant memory still lived inside them, and memory was a flaw to remove. The storm outside intensified. The wind tore against the shutters with a fury that made the entire house tremble. No one dared leave the estate, not even the Howards, whose confidence rarely faltered. They continued their routines with their usual quiet determination, though the cold changed them too. Mrs. Howard's smile grew tighter, her patience thinner. Mr. Howard spent long hours in the sealed study, pacing with his hands clasped behind his back. The children felt the tension rising like a slow tide. They knew winter revealed truths more mercilessly than summer ever could. On the 7th night of the storm, the tapping changed. It became urgent, sharp, deliberate strikes in patterns that seemed to form something close to communication. The children woke from their narrow beds, sitting upright as if pulled by invisible strings. Even the youngest ones, those stripped so deeply of memory that they barely reacted to anything, turned their heads toward the sound. The tapping moved through the walls like a small creature running behind them. But this was no creature. The rhythm was too precise, too human. Outside, a neighbor walking the ridge paused when he heard the sound echo faintly across the snow. He listened. The wind carried the tapping toward him, swallowing parts of the pattern but not enough to conceal its purpose. He expected to see someone outside the Howard home, someone trapped, signaling, begging for help. But the snow around the estate was perfect, untouched. Not a single footprint marked the ground. Inside, the children rose silently, drawn to the walls by instinct stronger than obedience. Something hidden was trying to reach them, something trapped in the dark places the Howards claimed did not exist. And in the Crescent Child's chest, the memory of honey-yellow light flared with sudden clarity. Someone was calling. Someone wanted to be found. The orchard behind the Howard estate had always been oddly barren. Its trees grew tall but produced little fruit, their branches twisted toward the sky like arms reaching for help that never came. In summer, the leaves hung limp. In winter, the trunks stiffened into dark silhouettes against the snow. The townspeople assumed the soil was bad or the trees were planted at the wrong time. No one questioned why the Howards tended the orchard so carefully despite its refusal to yield anything useful. No one asked why they often walked between the rows at night instead of day, their lanterns swinging low, illuminating patches of disturbed earth. Some things were easier left unspoken, but winter eventually broke, and the storm that had sealed the house in silence thawed into thick, heavy mud. The Howards hired temporary workers from town, men paid in cash to clear broken branches and dig out stubborn roots. They were told to keep their heads down, finish their tasks quickly, and ask nothing. Most obeyed because work was scarce that year. But even those who wanted to stay ignorant felt uneasy as they stepped into the orchard. Something about the ground felt softer than it should. The soil settled under their boots with a strange give, as though it had been turned recently, repeatedly, for reasons no one explained. The first discovery happened at midday. A young worker named Samuel struck something hard beneath a shallow layer of earth while digging near an old apple stump. At first he thought he had found a stone, but as he brushed the dirt away, a small wooden carving emerged, tiny, delicate, shaped like a curled animal that wasn't any creature he recognized. The wood was worn and smooth from handling, as though someone small had clutched it for comfort long before it ended up buried there. He held it up, frowning, unsure what to make of it. Another worker called him over minutes later, pointing to a scrap of cloth tangled in a root. It was small, torn, and embroidered with uneven stitches. The pattern made no sense, but the thread was faded pink, the kind used for a child's clothing. Samuel felt something cold settle in his chest. The cloth was too clean to be decades old, yet too fragile to belong to anything recent. When he raised it toward the light, the fabric trembled in his hand like it did not want to be seen again. By afternoon, someone else unearthed a thin wooden token, round, smooth around the edges, carved with a symbol no one could interpret. Not a letter, not a number, not a mark from any known system. It was a shape balanced between geometric and organic, the sort of carving done slowly by someone with intention. Samuel recognized the chill that ran down his spine. The shape was eerily similar to the one he had seen hanging from the neck of a Howard child years ago, back when the Howards occasionally visited town with their too-perfect posture and their silent, obedient shadows following behind them. Leaning in to inspect it, he noticed something else. The backside of the token held small dents like tiny bite marks, as if someone young had chewed on it for comfort. No one spoke this observation aloud. The discoveries continued. More carvings surfaced. Small wooden figures with missing limbs, half-stitched fabric pieces, charred fragments of paper with strange symmetrical markings. The workers tried to dismiss them as remnants of old toys or forgotten family items. But each object was too purposeful, too personal, too out of place. And all of them were buried deeper than any family memento should have been. Samuel's shovel eventually struck something larger, something that made a dull, hollow thud. He froze. The noise didn't sound like stone. It sounded like wood, thin wood, old wood, shaped wood. Together the workers dug around the object. What surfaced was a lid attached to a small box. The box was child-sized. Samuel's throat tightened as he brushed away the dirt. The wood was swollen from moisture, but the carvings remained clear enough to see. Symbols lined the edges, carved with the same precision as the tokens. Inside the box lay more fragments, cloth, wire, narrow sticks bound together as if to hold a shape once recognizable. No bones, no remains. But their absence felt wrong, intentional. Someone had removed the evidence that belonged inside these boxes. Someone had separated the pieces of lives and scattered them across the orchard like a puzzle meant to be hidden forever. One of the older workers murmured that the orchard had never been a place for fruit. It had been a place for burial of things that would have spoken louder than any witness. Word spread through town before the sun set, not through gossip, but through glances shared between neighbors who had always sensed something dark beneath the Howard family's calm surface. They remembered the missing children over the years, the ones who supposedly ran away or vanished during the long winters. They remembered never seeing footprints in the snow. They remembered the Howards' too perfect smiles. As night settled, the orchard felt heavier, as though the ground carried memory now, not silence. The workers left quickly, refusing to return the next day. Samuel walked home with the carved animal in his pocket, feeling its smooth edges press against him through the fabric. It felt like someone small had once held it tightly in fear. He wondered how long it had been buried. Back in the estate, the Howards noticed the disruption. Mr. Howard stood at the window, watching the workers flee. Mrs. Howard paced the hall, her steps sharp, her breath thin. The orchard was never meant for discovery. It was meant for erasure, and erasure once interrupted had consequences. Deep beneath the roots, beneath the soil that had hidden too much for too long, the ground had revealed a truth the town never wanted to believe. The Howards had not collected children out of kindness. They had collected them for purpose, and the purpose had been waiting in silence for the world to finally see. The Howard estate had been empty for nearly 20 years. Time had not softened it. The windows remained dark, the shutters stiff. The orchard behind the house a crooked graveyard of rotting branches and sunken earth. The town avoided it out of habit rather than fear. People had learned to walk faster when passing the old property, eyes fixed ahead, hearts tightening with a wordless warning not to look too closely. Silence was easier. Silence made the world feel safer. But silence also leaves room for secrets to grow stronger, and the Howard home had been holding its breath far too long. When the investigator arrived, he came alone. He wasn't a local. Outsiders always noticed the shadows the locals trained themselves not to see. His name wasn't important, only that he carried a folder thick with old reports, missing persons notices, and statements from neighbors who had whispered too quietly to be heard in their own time. He had spent months requesting access to sealed county records and long-forgotten ledgers. Something in the documents had bothered him. Not what was written, but what wasn't. Every trail that led to the Howard children ended abruptly, as if someone had erased the last chapter of every story. He approached the estate on a cold morning in late autumn. Frost clung to the grass, crunching under his boots. From a distance, the house looked lifeless, but when he stepped onto the porch, the boards groaned under his weight as though waking from a long sleep. The front door was locked, but the wood was old and brittle. One hard shove splintered it near the rusted latch. As the door swung open, he felt a breath of stale air push against him. Warm, somehow, despite the cold outside. The house inhaled him before he took his first step inside. Dust lay thick on every surface, yet nothing felt truly abandoned. The furniture remained arranged with unsettling precision. The rugs were perfectly straight. The hall table held a single dried flower in a vase, positioned exactly where someone had once decided it belonged. It was as though the tenants had left in a hurry but expected to return at any moment. The investigator sensed immediately that the house was not empty. It was waiting. He began his search in the main hall. His flashlight beam trembled slightly as he traced it across the walls. The wallpaper looked normal at first, faded roses, small vines curling, but up close he noticed the faint impressions beneath it. Outlines, hidden boards, concealed seams, doors behind the walls. He peeled back the paper with gloved hands. The seams were real. Someone had covered entire door frames with thin wood panels, sealing them out of sight. He pressed his ear to the largest one and felt a faint, cold draft seeping through the cracks. Whatever lay behind it still breathed with the air of the house. He pried the boards loose. Behind the first hidden doorway was a narrow passageway lined with hooks, empty now but clearly once used to hold something, perhaps coats, perhaps tokens, perhaps something else entirely. The investigator stepped inside, feeling the temperature drop as the darkness swallowed him. His light landed on a second door at the far end, this one iron-bound and locked from the outside. The lock was broken easily with tools he'd brought. The door opened with a soft, reluctant sigh. Inside was a small room, barely large enough for a child to stand in without touching the walls. The floor was clean. Too clean, as though someone had scrubbed it after every use. On the walls were faint scratches, short, frantic, layered over each other. They weren't deep enough to draw blood, just deep enough to leave a record of wanting to escape. He backed out slowly, forcing himself to steady his breathing as he recorded what he saw. But this was only the beginning. The house had more to say. In the study, he found the journals. Stacked neatly on a shelf, each bound in dark brown leather, the spines unmarked. Inside, the entries looked like ordinary family logs, weather notes, orchard updates, receipts for livestock feed, but the handwriting changed subtly every few pages. The early entries flowed warmly, like the thoughts of someone who believed in their purpose. The later pages grew colder, more structured, more clinical. Sentences became shorter, observations sharper. The tone shifted from affection to analysis. Then came the coded entries, symbols drawn in columns, rows marked with dates. Each symbol matched the tokens found in the orchard. The investigator cross-referenced entries with missing child dates from old county records. The patterns overlapped. The Howards had kept children not for guardianship, but for shaping them around roles, rituals, and experiments that no sane mind would consider. The journals described revision cycles, eradication sessions, vessel formation, and identity clearing. The language was calm, almost gentle, but the content was monstrous. The Howards had believed children were raw material, soft, changeable, pure enough to mold into whatever form their old doctrines required. The tokens were not identifiers. They were stages. Each child was moved from symbol to symbol, erased a little more each time. The deeper the investigator went, the more the house revealed. Under a loose rug, he found a trapdoor leading to the basement. He pushed it open and descended the narrow ladder into a low room lit only by the beam of his flashlight. Shelves lined the walls, filled with more tokens than he could count. Hundreds, maybe thousands, each carved with symbols he had never seen in any known alphabet, each representing a child who had passed through this place and left no trace behind. In the center of the room stood a long wooden table. The surface was scarred with thin knife marks arranged in strange curved patterns. Not violent marks, ritual marks, as if something had been carved there over and over in a repeated pattern, refining the technique until there was nothing left to improve. The investigator's hand hovered above the grooves without touching them. feeling the cold echo of something that had once thrived here under the guise of discipline. Then he saw them, names. Not names of children, but the names the Howards had chosen for their symbols. Names of roles, names of stages, names of purposes, observer, vessel, listener, carrier, echo. None were human. He found the last door near the far corner of the basement. Metal, reinforced with a latch that had been welded shut long ago. It took him nearly 10 minutes to cut through it. When the door finally gave way, a rush of warm air engulfed him, as though the room had been holding its breath for years. Inside, the walls were covered with drawings, made by children. Some were simple, shapes, lines, circles. But others were more disturbing. Drawings of the house itself, split open like a creature, its rooms connected by pulsing veins. Drawings of symbols floating above the children's heads like halos. Drawings of the Howards with empty faces. But what froze the investigator were the drawings of the orchard. Beneath the trees, the children had drawn rows of boxes. Dozens, hundreds, each box marked with a symbol. Not all had been found. Not all would ever be found. The investigator stepped back, breathing hard, understanding now that the house had never been silent. It had been speaking for years, through the walls, through the ground, through the things buried beneath the orchard. And now it had opened its mouth fully, offering its entire truth in one breath. When the investigator emerged from the basement hours later, the house felt different. Lighter, almost, as though releasing its secrets had loosened its hold on the world. He walked out without looking back, clutching the journals and photographs. The evidence would change local history. It might spark laws. It might uncover more buried truths. But as he reached the gate, he paused. Behind him, the house creaked softly, a long, low sound, almost like a sigh, almost like relief, or almost like hunger returning after a long sleep. The town had spent decades pretending the Howard estate was only a house, old, empty, unremarkable. But truth has a way of seeping out like groundwater, especially when the soil has been fed with secrets. When the investigator's report was released, the first reaction was disbelief, then confusion, then a slow collective shudder as each page dismantled the narrative the community had built to protect itself. The state unsealed records that had been locked for generations, adoption ledgers, school attendance logs, old social service files that had been misfiled or lost at convenient moments. There were gaps everywhere, as though someone had deliberately shaken the archive like a box and allowed the smallest, most fragile pieces to slip out. But the fragments that remained were enough. Enough to link the tokens to individual missing children. Enough to connect the orchard to dates that had once been dismissed as coincidences. Enough to force the state to acknowledge what it had failed to see. Families came forward, some cautiously, some trembling. Many were older now, grandparents who had once been young parents, who had been told their missing children had run away or disappeared during bad winters or left town with strangers. Some carried photos worn thin from years of clutching them during sleepless nights. Others brought memories that felt brittle from disuse, small details that resurfaced with surprising sharpness in the wake of the revelations. A girl who vanished after walking home from church. A boy who disappeared on a summer trip to the orchard. A pair of siblings whose trail ended at the general store, last seen following a wagon down the road. The truth did not give comfort. It gave weight. State officials, shaken by the implications, introduced sweeping reforms. Adoption laws were rewritten, oversight tightened, private guardianship reviewed with scrutiny it had never known before. New protocols were drafted with urgency, the kind designed after a tragedy no one dared to name publicly. The Howards had not just shaped children, they had shaped the loopholes that let them vanish. Closing those loopholes became the state's new obsession. The investigator testified before committees, his voice steady but hollow. He spoke not as a man chasing truth, but as one who had been caught by it. His photographs became exhibits. His notes became law. But the parts of the story that mattered most, the rooms, the drawings, the cold hum of rituals carried through walls, those were never spoken aloud in full. Even lawmakers have limits on what they can bear. The town, meanwhile, wrestled with its own guilt. Some remembered wagons arriving after dark. Others recalled children who walked differently, stared differently, spoke with rehearsed politeness that never sounded like childhood. A few admitted to hearing noises near the orchard, seeing small figures vanish between trees, feeling a chill when passing the Howard gate. Those memories had been buried under fear or convenience. Now they rose like disturbed roots. After months of discussion and unease, the state approved a memorial. It was placed near the orchard's edge, where the ground still felt restless. A simple stone monument, tall enough to be seen from the road but humble enough not to intrude on the landscape. The town commissioned an artist to carve symbols along the edges, not the exact ones from the tokens but gentle reinterpretations, softened into shapes that suggested hope instead of horror. At the center was an inscription, for the lost, the erased, the unheard. May they find peace beyond the reach of silence. The dedication ceremony took place on a warm spring afternoon. Families gathered with candles, flowers, and photographs held carefully in both hands. The wind rustled through the orchard, carrying the faint scent of blossoms. People spoke in low voices, sharing stories that had never found air. The investigator stood at the back, silent. He did not approach the stone. Some truths sit too heavily to place beside flowers. By sunset, the ceremony ended. The candles were left burning at the base of the monument, flickering like tiny guardians. The townspeople walked home as the sky shifted from orange to deep blue. For the first time in decades, no one hurried past the Howard property. But when night fully settled, the town's old instinct returned. People avoided the orchard. They avoided the new path leading to the memorial. They avoided the stretch of fence where frost still clung even in warmer months. Some swore they heard voices drifting across the fields, soft, fragmented, like conversations carried between distant rooms. Others reported tapping sounds echoing from the orchard, faint but steady, matching no natural rhythm. A few claimed they had seen movement in the trees, shadows shifting against the grain of the wind, subtle enough to doubt yet distinct enough to fear. The sheriff dismissed these stories, calling them residue of the town's shaken nerves. Memory plays tricks, he said. Trauma echoes. And perhaps that was true. Perhaps the voices were only the town hearing itself. Its guilt, its grief, its belated awareness. But some nights, when the air was cold and the moon thin, the orchard felt alive in a way that could not be explained. The ground seemed to pulse softly beneath the roots. The wind carried patterns instead of randomness, and the taps, steady, measured, rhythmic, felt less like memory and more like persistence. As if something beneath the soil was still trying to be heard. As if the town's silence had not been enough to keep everything buried. When the story of the Howard estate finally settled into the public record, people tried to speak of it with certainty, as if putting it into official words would tame something wild. Committees stamped reports, judges signed rulings, and newspapers printed their headlines in large, comforting fonts. But none of these efforts touched the truth that lay beneath the surface. Because what the Howards created was not just a hidden system of cruelty. It was a lesson in how evil thrives when wrapped in the right shape. The couple never shouted, never raged, never behaved like monsters in stories. Their harm grew from quiet gestures, polite smiles, and a reputation strong enough to make people look away. That was the part that frightened the public most, the realization that the Howards never needed force to hide what they did. They only needed silence. As the narrative pulled back from the individual horrors of the rooms, the journals, and the orchard, a wider picture emerged. Evil did not start the day the first child entered the estate. It began earlier, in the spaces where people chose comfort over truth. Neighbors who noticed strange behavior but convinced themselves it was none of their business. Officials who misplaced reports because investigating was too inconvenient. Families who accepted vague explanations because the alternative was too painful to imagine. Each small choice, harmless on its own, formed a shield that protected the Howards better than any lock or secret door. In this sense, the cruelty that unfolded inside the estate was not only the work of two individuals, it was the result of a community learning to look away one moment at a time. The investigator who uncovered the house's final secrets wrote about this in his last report, choosing words that were plain but heavy. He described the Howards as masters of ordinary behavior, people who blended into society by imitating kindness exactly the way someone imitates handwriting, close enough that no one questions the signature until years later, when it is too late to undo the damage. Their smiles in town, their polite greetings, their donations to the church, these were not signs of goodness, but tools of disguise. They understood that people trust what feels familiar, and they used that instinct like a blade. Each act of courtesy was a step toward invisibility, the perfect hiding place for intentions no one wanted to suspect. When the documentary teams arrived years later, filming the empty house and the orchard, they struggled to capture what truly lingered. The rooms were quiet. The walls had been washed. The symbols sanded down. The air carried no obvious signs of harm. Yet every person who entered the estate sensed something unsaid pressing against the silence, as though the place remembered more than it was willing to release. A historian described it as a house built out of other people's forgetting, and perhaps she was right. The structure felt hollowed, not by time, but by the weight of secrets carried too long. Viewers watching the footage felt a different kind of fear, less about what happened and more about how easily it could have continued. The Howards were not supernatural or superhuman. They were organized, patient, careful. They hid behind normal routines the way a shadow hides behind its source of light, always close enough to be overlooked. The children they took were not chosen for ritual alone. They were chosen because their disappearances could be explained away. Harsh winters, distant relatives, misfortune. The Howards exploited every assumption, every blind spot, every gap in the system. This was the root of the story. Evil often grows in the space between what people notice and what they choose to accept. It grows in polite conversations where no one asks the uncomfortable question. It grows in families who feel something is wrong but do not want to seem suspicious. It grows in the quiet corners of institutions built to protect the innocent but weakened by disorganization, pride, or fear. In the Howard case, evil did not need darkness. It needed silence, the most reliable shield of all. As the final section of the investigator's report was read at the memorial ceremony, the words struck the audience with a deeper, more universal truth. He wrote that society imagines monsters as loud, angry, obvious. But in his experience, the most dangerous ones speak softly, smile when expected, and move through the world with practiced calm. They depend on silence the way a fire depends on oxygen. Remove it and the flame cannot survive. Allow it, and the destruction spreads quietly until the damage is beyond repair. And so the story ended where it began, with a community facing the cost of ignoring its unease. The house was gone now, dismantled board by board to make room for a new field. The orchard still stood, changed but not erased. The memorial bore the weight of names that had never been spoken while the children lived. Yet the legacy of the Howards lingered not in the ruins, but in the questions left behind. The final question is the one viewers must carry with them long after the narration fades. Evil like this does not appear suddenly. It grows slowly, patiently, inside the spaces where no one is watching. It wears normal faces. It uses familiar language. It hides behind trust and tradition and good manners. So the voiceover closes with the question that matters most, the question the town avoided for decades, the question every viewer must now face. What do you think? Could this happen again?